what is an operating system? An operating system is a program that runs in a computer, or a set of programs whose job it is to do all of the functions to make a computer useful. Without an operating system, a computer would not be useful, very useful. Now, we've already talked about the BIOS, the basic input-output system, that's a part of your PC, and it's built into the motherboard inside of one of the integrated circuit chips. It's on a read-only memory, in other words. And BIOS is, of course, an important part of your PC because it's the interface to the hardware. It's the input-output system, or the basic input-output system. And as we'll talk about, the operating system works with BIOS, but it's in addition to that. It provides a lot of other services to make our computer useful. So, what are some of the things that an operating system does for us? What does an operating system do for us? Well, one of the things it does is it provides a file structure, a file system to store information on the mass storage systems. That would include the hard drive, optical storage such as CD and DVD, and flash memory, typically. Could also include a floppy disk. That's kind of a legacy technology or an older technology, which is obsolete, but that's an example also of a file system. In fact, the original IBM PC used just floppy disks for storage. And we maintain backward compatibility with older technology. Another thing that the operating system does for us is it provides a way of communicating with hardware for the user and the applications. It allows different programs to communicate with the computer hardware. So, for example, if a program wants to put something on the screen, it communicates with the operating system, and then the operating system does that for us, for the program that's running. And then another thing the operating system does is it allows different programs to run on the computer without interfering with each other. So that allows you to have multiple tasks running on the same computer. Now there's a number of different operating systems out there that are popular. Some of them are more popular than others, but they all have a lot of characteristics in common. So what we're going to talk about really applies to most different operating systems out there. And the three most popular ones are the Windows family of operating systems, which this class primarily focuses on, because it has by far the largest market share. And then the other two most popular are the Apple operating systems, OS X, would be the current, or Mac, as people often refer to it, and Linux, or the Unix family of operating systems. And what we're going to talk about today applies to all three of those, and the characteristics of these operating systems are very similar in many ways. Even the file structures are very similar. But everybody has their favorite things that they run, and like right now I'm running Linux right at the moment. That's what I'm displaying on a computer. So that happens to be the operating system I'm running. But I'm going to show you Windows too. So we'll look at, or in fact, we're going to focus on Windows. Now, operating systems are very complicated, and they have many parts to them. And they're infamous over the years for having problems. People, I'm sure you used a computer and something's gone wrong. And it's always been that way. I mean, I've been using PCs in different forms since 1979. That makes me feel old. But my first computer was one my mother bought for me, a TRS-80. And it didn't have much of an operating system at first. Basically, when you booted it up, it came up in BASIC. But later, they had a disk drive for it, a floppy disk, and it had operating system. And they were constantly fixing bugs in that operating system, and it was a pretty simple operating system. In fact, it was a lot like DOS, like we're going to talk about today. And I don't know if they ever got all the bugs out of that. Finally, it kind of faded into obscurity, and I went through a number of, I got very interested in computers, and it kind of led along to a career path, I would say. But even today, the latest operating systems still they're not perfect. They have problems because they are pretty complicated. One of the reasons I put Linux on this computer here is I was trying to do what I'm doing right now, is make slideshows and videos, and I just happened to find some software that works great in Linux, and I couldn't get it to work in Windows very well, but it sure works good in Linux. So for my application right now, what I'm doing, this happens to be the one I chose, and I'm pretty happy with it. I really like it, actually. But Windows I'm actually more familiar with, so I'm having to learn new things here.
What type of Linux do you have?
This is Ubuntu I'm running right now, Ubuntu Linux. That's the most popular flavor out there right now in the world, and it's very well supported. In fact, I will talk more about Linux next week, and so I'll show you, and also Apple and so forth. We'll talk about. Maybe some of you have your favorite operating system that you use. Now, what is the parts of an operating system? Well, you can look at an operating system as a kind of an overview as a kernel, or the core of the operating system. The kernel is kind of like the boss of the operating system. It controls everything else. And Windows has a kernel, Linux has a kernel, and OS X all have a kernel. It's the central command part of the, and everything connects to it. And one of the things that connects to the kernel is the file system. And Windows has primarily two different file systems that they can use. One's called FAT, that's an older file system, file allocation table, and the newer system called NTFS. Linux has several different file systems you can choose from, and I think Apple OS X I'm not as familiar with, but it primarily uses one file system. So you can actually, it's sort of modular. You can change parts of an operating system depending on the circumstances. Another thing that connects to the kernel is the interface to the hardware. And that would include drivers. Those are programs that communicate with hardware, and communication with, in the PC, that would be communicating with the BIOS. The basic input-output system is included there. So the kernel is separate from those interfaces, because what you can do is you can move the kernel to different hardware. So you might, what they would call, port the operating system to a different set of hardware, and you could still keep the same kernel, but you just change the interface. This is called modularity, breaking the programming down into pieces. Now, that didn't used to always be the case in the past. In earlier computers, things weren't so modular. It was all kind of put together, and when the hardware changed, they had to change everything, not just the modules. Another thing the operating system provides is security. Security for the file system is a big one. In other words, how do you keep files from being overwritten accidentally, or how do you keep the right people accessing the right files on your computer? How do you make sure that files aren't accidentally deleted when they shouldn't be, for example? Early versions of Windows didn't have much security. The later ones, Windows XP had some security, and Windows Vista and Windows 7 have much better, very good security. Linux has very good security. Apple OS X has very good security. So that's a big issue nowadays, is security, especially in the world with malicious viruses and things like that that try to attack our operating systems and take control. And then computer management. The operating system is responsible for allowing you to configure your computer and managing all the resources on the computer, including the hard drive, of course, the file system, the memory in the computer, and if there's more than one processor, it manages those processors. It delegates tasks to those different processors. Operating system is layered. It has different parts to its functions, and we have a layering of components to our computer. The operating system is the middle of this layering. It acts as a go-between between the application software, those would be the programs that you use as a user, and the hardware. The operating system communicates with the hardware. Many times it goes through the BIOS for basic hardware. Basic input-output system means that it deals with the basic hardware like the video display in its basic modes, the keyboard, the mouse, the hard drive. Those things go through the BIOS. Other hardware, though, the BIOS might not necessarily know how to deal with it, so the operating system in that case would deal with that directly using drivers. And the idea is that the application software does not talk directly to any of the hardware. It always communicates with the operating system. Same with the user, with you and I. We communicate with the operating system communicates with the hardware. That makes things a lot better from the standpoint of portability and future backward compatibility. A program can be written and not have to be changed just because the hardware becomes upgraded later or changed. New hardware can be developed, and the things that have to be changed for it would be the drivers that communicate with the operating system. So communication with that hardware would change, but the operating system would have to know about that, but the application software wouldn't. That didn't used to be the case. In the early days of personal computers, when the hardware would change, the various programs, the application software would then have to change to go along with it. For example, printers. In the early days of personal computers, if you had a new kind of printer, your software would have to know how to deal with that new kind of printer. And that became very challenging after a while. It was not a big problem initially when, say, a given brand of computer had just a few printers available to it. But when things got out of much bigger selection of printers, different manufacturers, things quickly got out of hand, and the operating system had to take over the business of dealing with printers.